Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are live. I'll check all my channels here real quick and we'll test it out. Okay. Let me know if the audio sounds good here. Take a quick phone call. 1 second, guys. Okay, what do we got here? Godfather J6. What is up, my man? Nice to have you in here. Robert Keller Jr. 8258. Outstanding. Good stuff. Rain Solid 1722. What's going on? Godfather says, sounds good. Great. Sax 19 or 913 says, RH going to stream Christmas this year. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you what that man's going to do. Don't know. Just don't know. My Online Ghost, man. Bringing back the OGs, the R2R OGs. Good to have you guys in here. MVS Crypt, good morning, Brandon. Hope you're having a wonderful day. I am having a wonderful, thankful day indeed. Outstanding job with everything that you're doing with marketing. I think it's great. You took the bull by the horns and you occupy a niche that nobody else occupies. You're doing very well with it. So good stuff. So, here in the United States, it is Thanksgiving. It's currently about 7 o'clock right now, a little bit after 7 p.m. And it's become somewhat of a tradition of mine, really for probably the past 4 or 5 years here, to get on stream here and talk to you guys about the real story of Thanksgiving. So, this was something that the late and great Rush Limbaugh did for many years before he passed away. If you guys don't know who that man is, I grew up listening to that guy quite a bit. He taught me a whole lot, man. I wouldn't know as much as I do now if it weren't for that gentleman. He taught people about life. He taught people about the relationship between citizens and their government. He helped us kind of decipher in the media what was going on. He had really, really good insight and experience. And, I've kind of pivoted towards not talking really as much on stream as I used to. Obviously, you guys remember when I would stream 2-3 times a day. Been putting in a whole lot of work in the background. Had a startup. We created buildthetech.com, and that was, I guess, August of 2023 now. So, been doing very well with that, and just trying to take the proverbial bull by the horns here. And it's been a real tough market for a lot of people. My message to those folks who are pretty downtrodden right now is basically this. It's like, if you're at the point where you're tired, you're beat up, your expectations have been so lofty for so long, you thought this was going to be something else. My message to you is just turn off the screens and go live your life. You don't have to participate in this. I'm talking about the crypto assets, right? You don't have to participate in social media. You don't have to do that. If this is beating you up psychologically, just take a step back. Come back in 4 or 5 years. Nobody can take your crypto away from you. So, let's see what else we got here. Trapped Gravity. The OGs of the OGs. I mean, he's been with me since the beginning. So, I want to talk to you guys about the real story of Thanksgiving. Now, here's the deal for even you folks who aren't American. This is a story that has been twisted in such a way to fit the narrative of socialists and multiculturalists around the world. Now, this is the truth. You're not going to get this anywhere else. Again, these are not entirely my words. These are the words of someone that I hold very responsible for educating me in truth throughout my upbringing. And I'm going to, we'll talk more about that person here at the end. So, as long as I have a YouTube channel and I'm able to, every Thanksgiving, I'm going to stream this. If you like it, cool. If you don't like it, that's cool too. I know it's going to piss off a lot of people, but it's okay. So let's begin here. The story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England under King James was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the church's absolute civil and spiritual authority, which is actually the state. Throughout history, sometimes you have more of a secular establishment, and then sometimes you have a non-secular establishment. But the common theme is these are the people that are chosen or not chosen to exercise government. And that can be a good thing for a long time, or it can be a bad thing, right? So those who challenged back then the ecclesiastical authority and those who believed strongly in the freedom of worship back then were hunted down. They were imprisoned. This was England in the early 1600s. And sometimes these people were actually executed for their beliefs. A group of separatists, these were the people who didn't want any part of this, first fled to Holland. They really liked the wooden shoes, and they really liked the cheese. And they established a community there in Holland. These people were there for 11 years. After 11 years, about 40 of these separatists who liked wooden shoes and cheese agreed to make a perilous journey to the New World, a new world that they had heard about. This was some new, exciting place that hadn't been developed. They knew that on their trek to the New World, they would face hardships. They would face hardships like, ladies and gentlemen, you and I do not know. And listen, I'm not preaching to you here. We don't understand the level of hardship. We don't understand the perils of travel. To across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1600s in a wooden ship, that's tough. And I've been on the Atlantic Ocean quite a bit, probably more than anybody here in this chat right now. And it is a big, dangerous, scary place. And it turns on you. It is unrelenting. So these folks, you want to talk about kahunas? They got balls, man. So we don't know the hardships that these people endured. We can't. And the reason that we can't is because we are, as a society, we're way too advanced right now. People who lived in the 1600s would not believe life today, folks. They would not believe it. Try to explain to somebody from the 1600s jet travel, flight. They wouldn't understand it. They knew they would face hardships, but paramount importance to them was living freely and worshiping God according to the dictates of their own consequences and their own consciences, their own beliefs. That's what they were denied the freedom to do in England. So, on August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 of these separatists, the Pilgrims. There were just 40 of them. They were led by William Bradford on the journey across the Atlantic. You want to talk about something that's extremely frightening and scary? That journey was very frightening and scary. The Mayflower was not much bigger than a 50-foot boat, and there were 102 people on it. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, that established just and equal laws for all 40 members of the Pilgrim community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. And it did not matter what their religious beliefs were. These are the laws that they were all agreeing to live by. Where did these revolutionary ideas, these laws, come from? We're talking about the Mayflower Compact. Cool. Hold on 1 second, guys. 1 second. Okay. So, the Mayflower Compact. That's what Bradford wrote. The Mayflower Compact derived from where? From the Bible. How many people have gone to colleges and universities and have listened to their professors try to convince the classroom that biblical values were not the core principles of the time? That this country, the United States of America, was not founded on those core principles. They are lying to you. They want to erase history, and they want to replace it with a version of the world that simply will not work. It does not work. It will never work. And why? Because men are not morally or ethically perfect. And we can dive way down into that. But at the root of everything, that's the problem. So, these pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testaments in the Bible. They were devoutly religious people, no matter what else is said about them, and even that is denied, they were devoutly religious. They looked to the ancient Israelites, for example, and because of the biblical precedents set forth in Scripture, they never once doubted that their experiment, their travel to the New World, would work. They believed in it. They never doubted that once they got there, they would thrive. The journey was long. It was arduous. The journey was dangerous. And when they finally landed, when the Pilgrims finally landed in New England in November. Who's been to New England in November? It's rough. According to William Bradford's detailed journal, they found a cold, they found a barren, they found a desolate wilderness. Imagine New England as it exists today is nothing but rocks, nothing but forest, undeveloped nature in November. And guess what? In November it's cold, but it's going to get even colder, right? And they knew that. This was a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. There were no friends to greet them, ladies and gentlemen. There was no shelter of any kind other than hiding under a tree. There was nothing. They had their boat. It was desolate. There were no hotels. There were no inns. There were no places to clean up. There were no houses. I mean, this was the definition of real hardship. The sacrifice that they had made for the freedom to worship was just the beginning. During that first winter. Now, remember, guys, they arrive in November during the first half of winter. Half of them, including William Bradford's own wife, died of starvation, died of sickness, died of exposure, frostbite, limbs falling off, hypothermia. They died of the elements. Now we're starting to get a little bit close to what you guys, at least in America, and probably most of the Anglo world is kind of taught about what this actually was. We're getting close to it now. When spring finally came, and by the way, writing that doesn't do it justice. When spring finally came. Spring doesn't just finally come, right? It was a survival. It was an act of survival that you and I cannot possibly relate to or understand. Maybe the only folks out there that kind of can relate to this are, American Special Forces or Special Forces. Military people who have purposefully been dropped into these environments to survive. Maybe they can understand what the Pilgrims were and what they went through. Most people can't. We've never done anything like that first winter in the New World. People in this chat, right? They survived it. Spring finally came. They met the Indians, the Native Americans who were there. These Native Americans did help them in planting corn and fishing for cod in that part of the world. They showed them where the beavers were, so the beavers could be skinned for coats and other things. And I know you animal rights people are not going to like this part of the story, but it happened. That's how they survived back then. But even with this degree of assistance from the Indians, the Native Americans, there was not prosperity on this barren new world. There was not prosperity yet. These people had the Mayflower Compact. They had these laws that they were living by, but there was no prosperity. People were dying. It was tough. And I wonder why. Now, this is important to understand here, folks, because this is where modern American history lessons end, with the Indians teaching the Pilgrims how to eat, how to fish, how to skin beavers, and all of that. That's where it stops, okay? And in American textbooks, they try to teach you that feel-good story. The white people, the Indians, they came together. Indians taught them everything that they knew. And if it weren't for the Indians, it would be game over, right? That's what we know. And then after that, in the textbooks and the professors, they then start the shaming effort, right? We stole the land from the Indians and this and that. That's where it goes. And then you're supposed to feel guilty for being alive hundreds of years later. Okay, we know that story. But I'm going to tell you something. That doesn't even come close to the true story. And you know, Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives. It wasn't that. Now, don't get me wrong, that happened. But Thanksgiving was a devout expression of gratitude from the Pilgrims to who? It was to God for their survival and everything that was part of it. Now let's get into the part that's been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims entered into in Holland, these people had sponsors. They didn't have money to do this trip on their own. They had sponsors. They were merchant sponsors in London, and they were merchant sponsors in Holland. And these merchant sponsors demanded that everything that the Pilgrims produced in the New World would go into a common store, a single bank, if you will, and that each member of the Pilgrim community was entitled to one share of that common store. So everybody out there had an equal share of whatever was in that bank. All the land they cleared, all the houses that they built belonged to that bank, to the community as well. And they were going to do what? They were going to distribute this equally because they were going to be fair, right? How many times have we heard that? And it's an interesting concept, you know, when you're younger and you think, yeah, we're just going to kind of all come together. We're going to build and we're going to cultivate and we're going to pool everything into one pile and everybody gets an equal share of that pile, right? It's kumbaya. It's cool. That's what we think when we're young. Till we grow up. We'll get more into that. So this belonged to the bank, belonged to the common store. Nobody actually owned for themselves anything. They just had an equal share in it. It was a commune. The Pilgrims, through that pact, established a commune essentially. The forerunner of communes that we saw back in the 60s and 70s and even today to some extent out in California, okay? They had their own organic vegetables. Yep. They were also the forerunners of organic vegetables, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. Of course, what else could there be? There was no such thing as processed anything back then, right? That was all organic. Coming full circle here. Now, William Bradford, who had become the governor of the colony because he was the leader, he recognized that this wasn't going to work. Well, what do you mean, Brandon? Why would this not work? This was actually very costly, this system that was set up, very costly and destructive. And it just wasn't working. It was collectivism. It was socialism before socialism, quote unquote, was put on paper. I guess 16, 17, 200 years later or so, 150 years later. That first winter had taken a lot of lives. The manpower was greatly reduced. So William Bradford, not Smith, right? Everybody thinks it's Smith. So William Bradford decided to take bold action. The Mayflower Compact was not working. Giving everybody a single share of stock in the common store and the common bank was not working. This was collectivism. It was as costly and destructive to the Pilgrims as it has been to anybody else who has ever tried it. It works for a short amount of time. Pick your country, okay? We had a lot of these experiments in the 20th century. And a lot of bad things happened. Bradford decided to scrub it. He threw out that compact and he took bold action. He assigned a plot of land to each family. Nobody had taught it like that up until this point. Every family was given a plot of land, right? So we didn't have a bank in a common store anymore. We didn't just pool all of our resources and kumbaya stuff. He said, no, that's not going to work. And there's a reason. We'll talk about why it doesn't work. So he assigned a plot of land to each family. They could work it. They could manage it however they wanted to. If they just wanted to sit on it, get fat, dumb, happy, and lazy, they absolutely could. If they wanted to develop it, if they wanted to grow corn, whatever they wanted to do on it, they could do. If they wanted to turn it into a quasi-business, they could do whatever they wanted to. He turned loose, ladies and gentlemen, the power of the capitalist marketplace. Long before Karl Marx and Mr. Engels was even born. Long before Karl Marx was a sperm cell in his father's dreams, the Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described, ladies and gentlemen, as socialism, and they found it didn't work. Now, it wasn't called that then. I understand that. Every year that I do this stream, somebody hits me up, sends me lengthy emails, comments. You know, they're going to travel up to Virginia and they're going to kill me and do all these horrible things to me. And they want to be sure that I know that I am historically inaccurate. Okay. And they say, you know, socialism wasn't even around back then. What are you talking about? Capitalism wasn't even truly defined back then. Like, what are you talking about, Brandon? I understand that. I understand that. But this had already been tried. And in fact, many of the people who defined what capitalism was in great specificity later on looked back at this as well. Looked back at this social experiment. So socialism, as we have described it in the colonies, not the colonies, but the Pilgrims rather, they found that it did not work. But it was socialism. That's exactly what it was. Everybody was getting an equal share. Now here's the kicker. How come this kumbaya idea, this idea that makes so much sense when we're younger, how come it didn't work? How come it doesn't work? And the reason it didn't work is because there was no incentive. Nothing worked. No one worked. Nothing happened. What Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else unless they could utilize the power of what? Personal motivation. Where does that come from? It comes from incentive. But while most of the rest of the world has been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 years, more, trying to redefine it, trying to perfect it. It's like tokenomics, right? Everybody's trying to find the Holy Grail, the panacea here. While they were trying to do that, the Pilgrims decided way early on to permanently scrap it. They had already scrapped it. They were like, hey, this doesn't work. And then it's been revisited. And it's not been good in the long run for anybody. Most of you guys don't know that Israel was a very socialist country. I want to say, 1960 to 1970 or so. They had to scrap it. It can be very good at first. But then all of those little intricacies rear their ugly head. Bad things happen. So, the Pilgrims decided early on to scrap it permanently. What Bradford wrote about his social experiment should be in every school child's history lesson. If it were, we might prevent much needless suffering in this world. If only the true story of Thanksgiving had been taught for years and years and years. So William Bradford, after putting everybody in a common store, the Mayflower Compact, they wanted to be fair. Kumbaya, right? They wanted everybody to have one common share of stock in everything that happened that the Pilgrims produced. And it nuked, bombed. It didn't work. There was no prosperity. There was no prosperity because there was no creativity. There was no creativity because there was no incentive. Here's what Bradford actually wrote from his diary, his journal, about the failure. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent. They weren't happy, in other words. This community was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, nobody worked. Nobody had incentive to work to make their lives better. They would depend on, just a handful of folks to do 80 or 90% of the work. Now, what's interesting, have you ever been a manager in corporate America and you've got a team of 20 or 30 or 100 or 500 people? You guys know this already. You have like 20%, probably less, 15% of people that do 90% of the work, right? The way that they set it up killed and discouraged work with the Mayflower Compact. There was no need. Now here's another quote directly from his journal. For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service, they sat around and did nothing, right? They should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without being paid for it. Why should they do that? So they didn't. Here's the quote. That was thought of as what? An injustice. How many times you get frustrated in the real world when you've got a team of people, right? And you're hard charging and you're putting in the work and you're sweating and you look around you and everybody's just watching you, or they're doing bare minimum. Why should you work for other people when you can't just work for yourself? What's the point? Do you guys right now, tell me in chat, do you guys hear what this gentleman was saying in his journal? Do you guys hear it, ladies and gentlemen? Let me know. Let me know what you think. So the Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. So what Bradford's community did next, what did they try next? They unharnessed the power of good old free enterprise. By what? By invoking capitalism. The principle of private property, all the way back in the 1600s. It was incredible. Every family was assigned their own plot of land, and they could do with it whatever they wanted. Bradford wrote, this had very good success, for it made all hands what? Industrious. So as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So basically, when profit, ladies and gentlemen, was introduced, when the opportunity to prosper was introduced, it went gangbusters. That, my friends, in essence, is the true story of Thanksgiving. Now, for some of you guys here, this is where it starts to get really good. If you're laboring under the misconception that I was taught in school. So this is going to make you feel a little bit better. So what did they do after they implemented this new system of prosperity? They set up trading posts and they exchanged goods with the Indians. And if you're upset that I'm using the term Indians, just cut me off, okay? That's your problem. So they set up trading posts, they exchanged goods with the Indians, and after they had enjoyed this prosperity, and by the way, it was not the Indians that actually brought to them this prosperity. That's the bomb. That's the difference. That's what children are being taught in schools by dum-dums, hollowheads. And I'm not saying this to insult anybody. Obviously, they played a very important part in the success of the Pilgrims in the New World. And we went over that earlier. But what led to this prosperity for the original settlers was the common store failed. Socialism did not work. It's when they introduced, and what turns out to be capitalism, that things started to turn around. They didn't have a name for it back then. We know that. Okay. But when they turned loose individual incentive, keep what you produce, sell what you don't need, it went crazy. This is not something that they were taught by anybody, by self-experience. That's how they were taught. They figured it out. The school, if you will, of hard knocks. It wasn't the Indians. None of this is said to put down anybody. Please don't misunderstand that. The Indians did a lot of things that helped them. And we're going to get more into that here in just a second. But it was their own industrious. They set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians. That's a quote. Okay. They sold things to them, and those profits allowed them to pay off their debts to the merchants, their sponsors in London and Holland. And you know what? The success of that colony, after they had abandoned socialism and tried what was essentially capitalism, the word spread throughout the world, throughout the old world, this massive amount of prosperity that was there for the taking in the New World. And guess what happened? The New World was flooded with new arrivals. The success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement had attracted more Europeans and became what came to be known as the Great Puritan Migration. And all it took was prosperity. And all it took was that prosperity and the word spreading across the Atlantic Ocean of how there was prosperity. And it was there for the taking. All you had to do was go there and give it a shot. The lesson is, ladies and gentlemen, the true story of Thanksgiving is that William Bradford and his Pilgrim community were thanking God for the blessings on their community after the first miserable winter of a documented failure brought on by their attempt at fairness, at their attempt at equality, which was socialism. Kumbaya. Didn't work. Only when they abandoned it, it did work. And I need to say it again, because I don't want people to misunderstand and get their noses out of a joint here, guys. The Native Americans, the indigenous people, whatever you want to call them, they called them the Injuns, right? And in all the old books, they were of considerable assistance, and they were friendly when the Pilgrims arrived. But they had little, if anything, to do with the actual prosperity, the process, the system of prosperity that actually occurred. It's going to be very difficult for some people listening to this to separate those two things. You have this new world. You have all these resources. There's different ways to do things. One way didn't work. The other way worked because it incentivized people and it took those resources and it turned it into wealth and prosperity for people. It's a way to approach it. This was the result of Bradford and the Pilgrim leadership deciding to change their structure, the Mayflower Compact. Indians assisted, we can't deny it. They taught them how to fish, and they taught them all sorts of things that they didn't know how to do in that part of the world. And that led them to be productive, undeniably so. But it was the Pilgrim community itself which experienced this massive prosperity because of the system that they implemented. Now, we mentioned earlier that the Federalists has a story on this, and in it they describe much of what we did in the now this is interesting. If you guys haven't read these books, Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims, super good for children to be able to read. Have a fun way to understand this historical context. Those books, Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims, that goes into actually really great detail about how the Indians did provide assistance and what kind of assistance it was and how valuable and crucial it actually was at that time. During the winter of 1620, only 44 out of the original 102 pilgrims survived, including their first elected governor of the colony, John Carver. And guess what? It was an Indian named Squanto. Who's heard of Squanto? Raise your hand. Yeah, you've heard of Squanto. Squanto is no ordinary Native American. Early settlers in 1610 had captured him and they sold him into slavery. A group of Catholic friars freed him and brought him to England, where he learned to speak English. In 1618, serving as an interpreter on an English ship, he was brought back to the New World. It was Squanto, who was a famous Native American in his own right, the Pilgrim's Story. Many people have heard about it. It was Squanto who taught the Pilgrims how to plant fish, how to skin beavers. It was Squanto who even brokered a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the other Indian tribes. He knew English and he knew the native tongue. There was more than one tribe of Indians. And ladies and gentlemen, you've heard this before. Like in the textbooks, they say it was just like, white man comes to America and he obliterates all of these peaceful, cohabiting folks all throughout the New World, right? The Native Americans. Guys, it was different nations. It was different nations that were feuding against each other, killing each other. They had territories, right? There was more than one tribe of Indians. It wasn't copacetic. It was not friendly. And it was not one with nature as people would have you assume it is. It's not anything like the multiculturalists would have you believe. There were squabbles. There were power struggles. There were turf battles. It was human. It was human nature. The Indians, the Pilgrims, everybody was scrambling for power, for survival. Survivability was the name of the game. And guess what? Survivability, ladies and gentlemen, is not guaranteed. Certainly wasn't guaranteed back then. Now, many of the Pilgrims literally believed that God had sent Squanto to save them. And they believed, the Pilgrims believed, that without Squanto, they would have never survived or thrived. And they experienced a tremendous harvest in 1621. And that's the big gathering that is taught in the history books. The Native Indians, the Pilgrims, they all joined together for a gigantic feast, which is actually the foundational story of the Thanksgiving story that's taught in public schools in America. And I presume with much perversion in other parts of the Western Anglo world. But again, that's not the real story of Thanksgiving. That's the textbook brand. It did happen, but there's so much more to that. And it's all been taken out on purpose to make you feel guilty and bad. Always love talking about and taking the opportunity every year to explain the actual truth, especially now that this given election that we just had and the previous elections that we've had, it gets really, really brutal. Certain parties throughout our government attempt to use lies and ignorance of history to demoralize many folks in the United States. And if you don't understand what actually happened, then you're going to buy into their brand of what actually happened. So you have to arm yourself with what? With knowledge of history. One of the most important legacies of early settlers is that they experimented with socialism in the 1620s and it didn't work. Private property rights and personal responsibility, two pillars of a free market economy, saved the Plymouth colony from extinction and laid the economic foundation for a free and prosperous nation that we all enjoy today. You guys see why personal property is so important? Not only in the United States, but anywhere else in the world. When you have personal property, there is a natural barrier. There's a natural air gap between you and the government. You own this. And they can't just come in and take it from you. That's why personal property is so important, amongst many other things. So private property rights and personal responsibility, two pillars of a free market economy, saved the Plymouth colony from extinction. Let's check chat here. Hex Glenn, what is up, my man? Nice to see you. Sandy Beach 369. Great to have you in here. Freddie Quotes in the house. What's up, my man? Great picture on that camera. Thank you, buddy. Tam Tam, Hexkin. How we doing, Tam Tam? Hexcavator, sup Rags. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, dude. Nice to see you around. It's crazy, man. You don't stream and then all these people pop up from your past. It's nice to see. Good to see here. Frankie, I love this tradition. Happy Thanksgiving. Yeah, Frankie reminded me that I hadn't streamed yet on Thanksgiving. Clintron, good day, R2R and crew, making Thanksgiving great again. Happy Thanksgiving from down under to my American friends. Now, let me check this out real quick. Yeah, I think we're showing all comments. Okay, good. The Bacon Sandwich Crypto. What's up, dude? Long time no see, Brandon Davis. Google, who decided the date of Thanksgiving? Let us know. Tell us. Thanks for sharing, Rags. Rain Solid 1722. All right. 45 minutes in. This typically takes about 45 minutes to 55 minutes. I'm going to read you guys a couple excerpts here from this book. You guys see that? A Capitalist Manifesto. Understanding the Market Economy and Defending Liberty. And I want to read these passages. It won't take long. It's a couple pages here. I want to read these passages because we're just missing so much context as to why all these experiments in capitalism over the past couple centuries here have produced the most wealthy nation on earth for a reason. They want to take it away. But then also we're dealing with power struggles. You know, if you guys don't understand what's happening in the UK, this broke today. Check it out, man. It's tough. No due process. Very little due process. Okay. No trial by jury for like 90% of offenses or 95% of offenses in the UK. That's a problem. Read into it. So this is Democracy as a Means to an End. Does a democratic government ensure a free society? The answer, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, is no. Having the ability to participate in the choice of government or in the legislative process does not necessarily result in individual liberty. A free people is not necessarily a nation of free individuals. Often we are led to believe that democracy is equivalent to freedom. The media has harped on this question, for example, of whether former communist countries in Eastern Europe are now democratic, using democratic as a synonym for free. These societies will be free when laws that are established protect individuals from coercion, whether that coercion is by an individual acting alone or a group using the power of government by majority rule. The key to a free society is how to limit the power of temporary majorities. This can be done by establishing a long-term principle to which members of society agree. Hayek said that a group becomes a society not by giving itself laws, but by obeying the same rules of conduct. This is consistent with Bastiat's position that morality is necessary for a system of laws. If there is no general consensus about a law, or at least the reasoning behind the law, then that law will be impossible to enforce. Interesting. It's a whole different layer. It's not just about having a law that's out there in the books. But if people don't buy into the fact that that law is legitimate, and if they don't obey that law, it becomes unenforceable when many people just decide to practice civil disobedience and say no to that law, right? That also underpins the importance of having, from a moral and ethical standpoint, a homogeneous society. It's very important. Morals and ethicals are extremely important. That's kind of the glue. That's the substrate that keeps everybody together here. However, democracy is also more likely to promote liberty than other forms of government. It's more likely to. Although the majority can still coerce the minority, there must be an opinion formed amongst a reasonably large percentage of the populace to allow that coercion to occur. There's nothing inherent in a majority opinion that makes it correct. You may have a profound respect for the concept of majority rule, but have strong doubts that a majority is going to be correct in its decision about a particular issue. The responsible citizens must then attempt to influence the majority. But this can happen only if there is what? Only if there's freedom of speech. Now you guys understand that too. Why is freedom of speech important? It's important because if you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have the ability to right the ship if things go south. You get snatched up and put in prison. The majority consolidates their power because there's nobody to push back on it. Freedom of speech is very important. And if you can't talk to your people publicly in a free way, you can't express ideas that might be better. On the flip side, if you can't have free speech, you can't communicate with publicly about your bad ideas. If you can't hear those bad ideas, you're not going to recognize them as bad. You need to have that debate. Ideas, you have to win an idea of a battlefield of ideas, rather. That's important. So freedom of speech is important for both of those reasons. Recall Mises' point that there is no line that divides economic freedoms and other freedoms. Freedom of speech is necessary, both to economic freedom and political freedom. The final question we raised at the end of the previous chapter dealt with the responsibility of the individual in a free society. Having liberty means that we must also accept the consequences of our actions. If we are free to decide what to do, then we must live with the consequences of our actions and our choices. A free society offers choices. It does not guarantee outcomes. You have the choice of deciding whether or not to become an opera singer. If you misjudge your talent or people's willingness to pay for your performance, then you must accept that outcome. You might suck. Your parents might have given you delusions of grandeur, but guess what? The marketplace is going to let you know real quick. You may starve and end up driving a taxi cab. Then you must feel that you have wasted all of those years of training listening to opera music. That is what freedom entails. No guarantees other than the freedom to make your own choices. A free society demands that its people be guided by the sense of individual responsibility. When individuals are allowed to act as they see fit, People must believe that the outcomes that result from those actions are the responsibility of the individual. This must be more than just a legal concept. It must be similar to a moral concept, one of those general principles by which a just society does what? Organizes itself. When people believe that individuals are responsible for their own actions, that has an effect on individual behavior. Of course it does. If you feel like there's always a massive safety net there for you, right? As opposed to not having one, you're going to think a whole lot harder and a whole lot longer about making these decisions. Because you have to accept the outcomes of those decisions that you make. It requires people to prepare more and make more efficient choices about the use of resources. When deciding to produce a certain product and expend resources in production, they're mindful of opportunity costs. If the value is greater in other uses, then they will have paid more to produce their product than they receive for it, and they go bankrupt. This reduces their standard of living, and they will be more careful than if the government reimbursed them for any losses they incurred. This sense of responsibility also provides a moral justification for the manner in which society is organized. When we know that in a market system, the distribution of income is actually determined by consumers, and that the individuals can garner and maintain wealth only by pleasing the consumers. It affects our attitudes about the redistribution of income, doesn't it? For some of us. In the same way, a sense that individuals are responsible for their actions results in a certain belief about the justice of the system. Take that famous socialist utopia novel of the late 19th century, Looking Backwards, 1887, by Edward Bellamy. Bellamy describes the economic system of the late 19th century. Europe is a carriage ride in which certain people randomly end up in the driver's seat and others randomly fall off into the mud, and then they're engaged in pulling the carriage. It is primarily luck that determines the distribution of income in a capitalist society. If you believe this, then you probably believe it is unfair that some people are rich and others are poor, and that a society should form a government that takes from the rich and gives to the poor. And that idea, that notion, is specifically targeted towards younger people. Because when you plant that seed in a young person's mind, without any interference or other ideas coming into that person's mind, that seed can grow into a socialist oak tree as they get older, which we have seen quite a bit. Notice also that freedom is important for the altruistic individual as well as the person who seeks only personal gratification. One can hardly be considered altruistic when contributing to a cause under the threat of imprisonment. That's coercion. You're going to make different decisions if you're coerced by your government. Unless you are free to choose not to contribute to a charity, and unless people believe that you are responsible for the good that occurs from your contribution, there is no room for altruism. The belief that it is a moral responsibility to volunteer one's time, treasure, and talent to the benefit of those less fortunate goes away. In a perfectly egalitarian society, there would be little altruism and a great deal of coercion. In a free society, there is no guarantee that the native ability, intelligence, or education will lead to success. In a market economy, the use to which you put your hands and talents and resources determines what your fortune will be. If you are lazy or make incorrect choices, then you will not be as successful as a person with less talent, with less resources, or works harder, or makes better choices. This sense of insecurity is what causes people to trade liberty for guarantees. Let me read that again. This sense of insecurity is what causes people to trade their liberty for guarantees, equality of outcome. There are risks involved in accepting, in my accepting responsibility for my actions. How do we ensure that a procedure of creating laws is likely to result in a free society? How do we articulate the general principle that society will follow? How can we ensure that a political system does not drift towards a coercive one? Those are some powerful words. We're right at an hour here, ladies and gentlemen. It's official. Our Thanksgiving stream 2025 is complete. Stay tuned till next year. And we'll do it again. And we'll add a little bit more here and there. Thank you guys for joining me. As always, my name is Brandon Davis, an artist formerly known as Rags to Riches. Please do not like. Please do not comment. Please do not subscribe. Ciao.